the hunger for flesh. There are few torments in the grim annals of eternity more profound than the silent ache of a king who traded his soul for a crown of living metal. In the deepest chambers of his tomb ship, where no light had blazed for 60 million years, Zarek the Silent King contemplated the price of immortality. His necrodermis fingers, gleaming with the cold radiance of perpetual existence, traced patterns across the command throne that had become both his seat of power and his eternal prison. The void between galaxies stretched endless beyond the ship's hull, a black ocean that mirrored the emptiness where his heart had once beaten. For millennia beyond counting, Zarek had wandered this darkness, fleeing not from enemies, but from the weight of what he had done to his people. Yet even in exile, the hunger followed him, or not the hunger for conquest or dominion, but something far more terrible, the hunger for flesh. He closed his eyes, though the gesture brought no darkness to his artificial senses, and remembered. The memory surfaced unbidden, as it always did in these quiet moments when the ship's systems hummed their mechanical lullabies. He saw again the face of his queen, Ankh-F-en-Sekhmet, in those final days before the great betrayal. Her skin had been pale as desert sand, marked by the radiation that poisoned all Necrontyre, yet beautiful in its fragility. When she smiled, lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes. When she wept, tears had carved channels down her cheeks. "Will you remember me as I was?" she had whispered in their final embrace, her body already beginning to fail as the biotransference chambers prepared to receive her consciousness. "Will you remember what it felt like to touch something that could truly die?" Zarek had promised her yes, not knowing then that the very capacity for memory would be altered, refined, stripped of all but the cold data of recollection. He remembered her words, but not the warmth of her breath against his neck. He remembered her face, but not the way her pulse had quickened beneath his fingers. The Citan had given them immortality, but stolen the very essence that made immortality worth having. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, breaking his reverie. His ship's sensors had detected something in the void ahead, a tomb world drifting silent and dark among the distant stars. Not one of the great dynasty worlds that dotted the galaxy like sleeping gods, but something smaller, forgotten, ancient even by the standards of his deathless people. "Designation unknown, my lord," whispered the ship's construct mind, its voice carrying the mechanical cadence that had replaced the living breath of his servants eons ago. Pre-dynastic construction, Necrontyre origin, but the archives show no record of its existence. Zarek leaned forward, his interest kindled for the first time in centuries, a world that had been hidden even from the Silent King's vast knowledge, a world that had somehow escaped the great sleep that followed their victory over the Old Ones. His orders came swift and certain. "Prepare the tomb barges, as we investigate." The descent to the world's surface revealed architecture that spoke of an era Zarek had thought lost to time. These structures predated the great monuments of the dynastic period, their lines more organic, their purpose unclear. As his scarabs probed the ruins, trickling data back through quantum entanglement, a pattern emerged that made his ancient consciousness stir with something approaching hope. This had been a research facility, but not one devoted to weapons or conquest. The laboratories beneath the world's crust had been dedicated to a single, desperate project that had consumed the final years of the Necrontyre Empire, Project Ankh-Sekhmet. The name blazed across his consciousness like a star being born, for he recognized it immediately. His beloved queen's name was given to humanity's most audacious attempt to preserve what biotransference would destroy. In the deepest vault, surrounded by quantum containment fields that had somehow endured 60 million years of dormancy, Zarek found what his people had died trying to create. The Soul Forge. A device of impossible complexity, its crystalline matrices designed not to transfer consciousness from flesh to metal, but to perform the reverse. To take the cold, digital essence of a Necron mind and breathe into it the warm chaos of organic life. The irony was not lost on him. His queen's name had been given to the very device that might one day return her to him, not as the soulless automaton she had become, but as the living woman he remembered. Yet as he studied the ancient schematics flickering across hololithic displays, Sharek felt the weight of a terrible understanding settle upon his consciousness. The Soul Forge required more than just organic matter to function. It required living hosts. Willing or unwilling, entire populations would need to surrender their bodies so that the Necron dead might live again. The very thing his people had become in order to defeat their enemies, they would need to do again to reclaim their humanity. Standing alone in that ancient laboratory, surrounded by the dreams of scientists who had died before seeing their work complete, Zarek the Silent King faced a choice that would damn or redeem not just himself, but every soul that had followed him into the long night of undeath. The hunger for flesh had found its answer. Whether that answer would prove to be salvation or a deeper form of damnation remained to be seen. But for the first time since awakening from the great sleep, Zarek felt something that might have been hope stirring in the place where his heart had once beaten. He reached out with one metallic finger and activated the Soul Forge's preliminary systems. Ancient power flowed through crystalline conduits, and somewhere in the device's quantum heart, the echo of his beloved's name whispered like a prayer across the dark. Echoes of the past. The Soul Forge hummed with the resonance of ancient power, its crystalline matrices casting patterns of light across the laboratory walls that had not seen illumination since the first dynasties fell into their deathless slumber. Sharek stood before the device, his necrodermis form reflected in its polished surfaces. Yet what blazed in his consciousness were not the cold geometries of the present, but the warm memories of decisions made in flesh 60 million years past. The hololithic displays flickered as quantum processors older than civilizations decoded the device's construction protocols. Each schematic that emerged told a story of desperate ingenuity, of Necrontire scientists who had foreseen the true cost of the Citan's gift and sought to build a bridge back to what would be lost. Yet as Zarek studied their work, he found himself drawn not to their technical achievements, but to the names embedded in the device's core programming. Scientists he had known, advisors who had served in his court, men and women who had whispered doubts about biotransference, even as the deceiver's promises echoed through the royal halls. "My lord," the construct mind of his ship whispered across quantum channels, "the archives have been cross-referenced. Project Anku Sekhmet was classified beyond even royal access. Its existence was known only to 7 individuals, all of whom died during the initial biotransference trials." Jarek's fingers tightened on the Soul Forge's control interface. 7 individuals. He remembered them now, their faces surfacing from the depths of his artificial memory, like ghosts rising from a digital grave. Chief among them was Ketikar, his oldest friend and most trusted advisor, whose final words before entering the biotransference chambers had carried a weight that Zarek had not understood at the time. "Forgive me, my king, for what I have built without your knowledge," Ketikar had said, his radiation-scarred face solemn with the gravity of unspoken secrets. "If there comes a day when you regret what we have chosen, remember that some of us never stopped believing there should be another choice." The memory blazed with painful clarity across Jarek's consciousness. Ketikar had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had foreseen the hollow victory that biotransference would bring, and in the final months before the Great Transformation, he had gathered like-minded scientists to create this device, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of faith. Faith that their king, when faced with the true cost of immortality, would seek to undo what had been done. The Soul Forge's deeper schematics revealed themselves As Zarek delved further into its quantum architecture, the device was more sophisticated than anything the Citan had shared with them, all its design incorporating principles of consciousness transfer that went beyond mere digitization. Where biotransference had stripped away the soul and left only the cold framework of thought, the Soul Forge promised to restore the capacity for growth, for change, for the beautiful chaos that had made mortality precious. Yet as understanding dawned, so too did horror. The process was not one of simple reversal, but of replacement. The Soul Forge required living hosts not as temporary vessels, but as permanent sacrifices. Each Necron consciousness that claimed flesh would utterly consume the original inhabitant, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of organic matter animated by mechanical thought. It was not resurrection, but a new form of biotransference, but one that traded the extinction of the Necrontyr for the extinction of whoever they chose to replace. Zarek stepped back from the device, his ancient consciousness reeling with the implications. To reclaim their humanity, the Necrons would need to commit genocide on a scale that would dwarf even their wars against the Old Ones. Entire species would need to be harvested, their bodies claimed by the deathless dead who sought to live again. The irony was bitter as poison. In their quest to escape the curse of the Citan, they would become the Citan, consuming other forms of life to sustain their own existence. "The preliminary calculations are complete, my lord," the construct mind reported, its voice carrying none of the emotional weight that such revelations deserved. Based on current Necron population estimates, the process would require the systematic harvesting of approximately 400 billion organic life forms. Optimal genetic compatibility suggests targeting human populations, as their neural architecture most closely matches pre-biotransference Necrontyr baselines. 400 billion. The number echoed through Zarek's consciousness, like thunder across an empty sky. 400 billion lives to undo what he had done to his own people. 400 billion souls to pay the price for one king's desperate choice made in the face of extinction. The weight of it settled upon him, not as guilt, but as a terrible understanding of what leadership truly meant. To save his people, he would need to damn others. To reclaim their lost humanity, he would need to steal it from those who still possessed it. The laboratory fell silent, save for the distant hum of quantum processors and the soft whisper of air recycling systems that had run without pause for 60 million years. In that silence, Zarek heard echoes of other conversations, other moments when the weight of impossible choices had fallen upon his shoulders. He remembered the day the Citan had first appeared to him, their false promises of immortality wrapped in the silver tongue of the deceiver. He remembered the moment he had sealed his people's fate with a single word of agreement. He remembered the day he had awakened to discover what that word had truly cost. Now, standing before another device that promised salvation at an unspeakable price, Zarek found himself facing the same choice that had defined his existence for 60 million years. Pragmatism or conscience. The needs of his people or the rights of others. The cold logic of survival or the warm chaos of moral uncertainty. The Soul Forge waited, its crystalline matrices glowing with patient radiance, neither judging nor condemning his hesitation. It was a tool, nothing more. The choice of how to use it, or whether to use it at all, remained his burden to bear. Yet as he contemplated the device his oldest friend had built in secret hope and desperate faith, Zarek felt something stirring in the place where his heart had once beaten. Not the hunger for flesh that had driven him to this place, but something else. Something that might have been the echo of the conscience that biotransference had not quite succeeded in destroying. The first test would be small, he decided. A single subject, carefully chosen and ethically sourced. Not to begin the great harvesting that the Soul Forge's full activation would require, but to understand the true nature of what Ketika and his fellow scientists had created. to discover whether the device truly offered redemption or merely provided new methods of damnation disguised as hope. As he began the preliminary activation sequence, quantum fields humming to life around the ancient laboratory, Zarek whispered a prayer to gods he no longer believed in for the wisdom to choose correctly when the moment of true decision arrived. The Silent King's Gambit. The quantum transmission cascaded across the void between stars, carrying with it the weight of authority that had once commanded the loyalty of 60 million worlds. In the deepest reaches of space, where tomb ships drifted like sleeping giants between the galaxy's spiral arms, the signal found its intended recipients. 3 dynasty heads whose loyalty to the Silent King had endured even through the long exile that followed the war in heaven. 3 lords whose ambitions had been tempered by wisdom, whose pride had been humbled by the cost of their ancient victory. Anrakiah the Traveler was the first to respond, his tomb ship emerging from the shadow of a dead world where he had been cataloguing the ruins of lesser species. His scarred features bore the marks of countless campaigns, yet when his image flickered to life in Zarek's hololithic chamber, the Traveler's mechanical voice carried something approaching reverence. "My king calls and I answer. Though I confess curiosity about what could draw you from your self-imposed exile among the cold stars." The second to arrive was Trusin the Infinite, his ornate form materializing through quantum translocation aboard his personal gallery ship. The archivist's obsession with collecting the remnants of history had made him invaluable in the past, his vast museums containing artifacts that even Zarek had thought lost to time. When he spoke, his words carried the measured cadence of one who had spent eons cataloguing the rise and fall of civilizations. The Silent King returns to active service. How deliciously unexpected. I do hope this gathering will prove worthy of preservation in my archives. The Third Lord arrived without fanfare, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in quantum fields that marked the passage of the Undying. Kutlak the World Killer had earned his epithet through methodical extinction campaigns that had lasted millennia, yet despite his reputation for absolute destruction, he remained one of the few dynasty heads who understood the true weight of command. His voice, when it came, was grim with anticipation. "The Tyranids stir in the void beyond our galaxy, my king. I have seen the shadow they cast across the light of distant stars. Is this why you have called us together?" Zarek stood before his assembled vassals, their forms rendered in shimmering, hololithic light that danced across the Soul Forge's crystalline matrices. The ancient device hummed with barely contained power behind him, its presence a silent testament to the magnitude of what he was about to propose. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of 60 million years of regret and the desperate hope of redemption. "The Tyranids are indeed a threat that we cannot ignore, Lord Kutlak. Yet they represent more than merely another enemy to be destroyed. They represent the extinction of all organic life in our galaxy. Should they succeed in their harvest, we will be left alone among the stars, forever trapped in these shells of living metal, with no hope of reclaiming what we have lost." He gestured toward the Soul Forge, its alien geometries casting shifting patterns of light across the chamber walls. "What you see before you is the work of our greatest scientists, created in the final days before biotransference. It offers us a chance to undo what the Satan convinced us to do to ourselves, a chance to reclaim not just life, but the souls that gave life meaning." The silence that followed his revelation stretched across the quantum channels like a physical thing. Anrakiah was the first to speak, his voice carrying disbelief, tinged with something that might have been hunger. "You speak of reversing biotransference itself? My king, even if such a thing were possible, the cost would be—" "Unacceptable," came a new voice, cold and sharp as a blade drawn in anger. The transmission originated from the Mandragora system, where the vast tomb complex of the Sautek dynasty blazed with the fury of its awakening overlord. Imhotep the Stormlord had been monitoring their communications. his ancient paranoia serving him well in detecting the quantum signatures of the clandestine gathering. Imhotep's image materialized among them uninvited, his ornate form crackling with barely contained electrical discharge. The Stormlord's reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his absolute conviction that the Necron race had achieved perfection through biotransference. When he spoke, his words carried the thunder of divine judgment. So the Silent King returns at last, not with wisdom gained through exile, but with the same flawed sentiment that has always been his weakness. You would trade our immortal perfection for the frailty of flesh. You would undo the greatest achievement in the history of our species for the sake of nostalgia and regret. The confrontation blazed across quantum channels as the assembled lords took sides in a debate that would determine the future of their entire race. Anrakir and Trazin remained silent, weighing the implications of what their king proposed. Kutlak, ever pragmatic, voiced the question that hung unspoken in the chamber. What would be required, my king? What would this reversal cost? Zarek met the Stormlord's blazing gaze across the void, his own voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Living hosts, billions of them. The process requires organic vessels capable of sustaining Necron consciousness while maintaining the neural pathways necessary for true sentience. Genocide, Imhotep thundered, his form wreathed in coruscating energy. You would make us harvesters of souls, no better than the Citan who deceived us. I will not permit this madness to proceed. Yet even as the Stormlord raged, Zarek was already implementing the first phase of his plan. The Pariah Nexus, his greatest creation since returning from exile, provided the perfect laboratory for initial testing. Within its reality-warping boundaries, the fundamental laws that governed life and death bent to Necron will. Here, captured specimens could be subjected to experimentation without risking exposure to the greater galaxy. The first test subject was a human pirate taken during raids on Imperial shipping lanes, his consciousness carefully preserved within quantum containment while his body was prepared for the transfer process. As the Soul Forge's energies flowed through its crystalline matrices, ancient protocols engaged with mechanical precision. The human's neural pathways were mapped and catalogued, his genetic structure analyzed down to the quantum level. The transfer itself lasted mere seconds. The pirate's consciousness was displaced, ejected into the void of non-existence, while the volunteer Necron Lord attempted to claim the vacant flesh. For one brief moment, success seemed within reach. The organic body drew breath under mechanical will. Eyes that had belonged to a human opened under the direction of a mind that had not drawn breath for 60 million years. Then rejection set in with devastating swiftness. The human's immune system evolved over millennia to recognize and destroy foreign invaders, to turn its full fury against the alien presence now inhabiting its neural pathways. Antibodies flooded the bloodstream. White blood cells attacked synapses that carried the wrong quantum signatures. Within minutes, the body convulsed and died, taking with it the Necron consciousness that had hoped to call it home. Failure, reported the observing construct minds with mechanical dispassion. Subject incompatibility at the cellular level. Recommendation: acquire genetically modified specimens with enhanced compatibility matrices. Sharek studied the data cascading across hololithic displays, his ancient mind processing failure rates and compatibility algorithms. The answer, when it came, blazed across his consciousness with the clarity of mathematical certainty. They needed specific genetic markers to bloodlines that had been shaped by exposure to the warp's chaotic energies. Humans whose ancestors had been touched by psychic phenomena, whose neural pathways had evolved to handle consciousness transfer. Ancient human bloodlines. Families whose genealogies stretched back to the dark age of technology, when humanity had dabbled in sciences that modern imperial doctrine considered heretical. The irony was bitter as grave dust. To reclaim their lost souls, The Necrons would need to steal them from those who had already paid the price for dabbling with forces beyond mortal comprehension. The test was illuminating, Zarek announced to his assembled vassals, ignoring Imhotep's continued protests. We know now what is required: specific genetic compatibility, enhanced neural resilience, bloodlines touched by the warp itself, or such specimens exist scattered across the galaxy among human populations that have forgotten their own ancient heritage. This madness ends here, Imhotep declared, his form beginning to fade as quantum transmission protocols prepared for combat deployment. I will not stand by while you transform our race into parasites feeding on the living. The dynasties will hear of this, and they will choose between the perfection we have achieved and the corruption you offer in its place. As the Stormlord's image vanished, leaving only the crackle of disrupted energy in its wake, Zarek felt the weight of inevitability settling upon his consciousness. The die was cast. The civil war that would determine the future of the Necron race had begun with words, but it would be decided with weapons. Yet for the first time in 60 million years, the Silent King felt something approaching hope burning in the place where his heart had once beaten. The path to redemption had been revealed. Whether it led to salvation or damnation remained to be seen. The bloodline, war among the stars, is not declared with fanfare or formal proclamation, but with the sudden silence of communications arrays and the dying light of tomb worlds as their defenders choose sides in conflicts that will reshape the galaxy. Across the Mandragora system, Imhotep, the Stormlord's will, blazed through quantum channels, carrying with it the fury of absolute conviction and the weight of ancient authority. His message found eager recipients among the traditional dynasties, those lords who had awakened from the great sleep to find their mechanical perfection unmarred by sentiment or regret. The Mefrit dynasty was the first to answer his call, their crimson tomb ships emerging from the Forge worlds where they had been perfecting weapons of annihilation. Zunbakir, their overlord, had always viewed biotransference as the ultimate achievement, a transformation that had elevated the Necron Tyre from frail mortality to eternal supremacy. When he spoke across the dynastic channels, his words carried the heat of solar furnaces and the certainty of mathematical proof. The Silent King has lost his way among the cold stars, Zunbakir declared, his voice resonating through quantum networks that spanned star systems. He would have us trade perfection for corruption, immortality for the weakness of flesh. This cannot be permitted, will not be permitted. Others followed in swift succession. The Novok dynasty, our masters of close-quarter annihilation, pledged their crimson legions to the traditionalist cause. The Nefrek dynasty, translocation specialists whose mastery of dimensional manipulation made them invaluable in rapid deployment, committed their silver fleets to Imhotep's banner. Within days of Sharek's revelation, half the awakened dynasties had chosen their allegiance, and the ancient protocols that had once united the Necron race began to fracture under the weight of ideological division. The first battle erupted in the Geddon Reach, where loyalist and traditionalist fleets encountered each other above a dead world that had once housed a research station. Neither side had intended to fight there, both merely seeking to secure ancient archives that might contain useful data. Yet when tomb ships bearing the regalia of opposing factions materialized from quantum translocation, the mathematics of war left no room for diplomatic resolution. Zarek himself commanded the loyalist fleet from the bridge of his tomb ship, its ancient hull scarred by campaigns that predated the rise of humanity. Around him, tactical displays showed the deployment of forces that had once conquered a galaxy, now turned against each other in pursuit of visions that could not be reconciled. When he spoke, his orders carried the weight of kingship earned through 60 million years of victories and defeats. "Disable their command ships, but do not destroy them," he commanded, his voice echoing through quantum channels to fleet commanders who had served him since before the stars were young. These are our people. Misguided, perhaps, but still our people. We fight to convince, not to annihilate. Imhotep, commanding the opposing force from his own flagship, harbored no such restraint. His tactical genius, honed through eons of warfare against lesser species, now found expression in the systematic dismantling of his former king's fleet. Lightning arced between his ships, discharging energies that could crack continents, while dimensional rifts opened to disgorge swarms of drone fighters that moved with the precision of mathematical equations given form. The battle raged across 3 star systems, as fleets maneuvered through hyperspace corridors and gravitational wells, each side seeking the decisive advantage that would end the conflict without mutual annihilation. Gauss arrays that could strip atoms from molecular bonds traded fire with Tesla destructors that channeled the fury of dying stars. In the void between worlds, the light of weapon discharges painted aurora patterns across the hulls of ships that had survived the war in heaven only to face destruction at the hands of their own kind. Yet even as Necron fought Necron in the cold reaches between stars, Zarek's scientific expeditions continued their grim work. The genetic surveys conducted during the war's early phases had yielded promising results, identifying several human colonies whose bloodlines carried the markers necessary for consciousness transfer. Chief among them was Kellyan's Rest, as a mining colony on the edge of imperial space where generations of exposure to warp storms had left the population with neural pathways uniquely suited to Necron requirements. The colony's isolation made it perfect for Zarek's purposes. Yet, as his forces approached the system, the Silent King found himself confronting a choice that would define not just his campaign, but his soul. Kellyan's Rest housed approximately 4 million human souls, men and women, whose only crime was genetic compatibility with an alien agenda they could never comprehend. To claim their bodies for the Soul Forge would require their complete extinction, not through the clean mathematics of orbital bombardment, but through the intimate horror of consciousness displacement. "The specimens are optimal, my lord," reported Anrakir the Traveller, his scarred features displaying none of the conflict that raged in Zarek's artificial consciousness. Precognitive scanning indicates compatibility rates exceeding 90%. A full harvest would provide sufficient material for the initial phase of mass consciousness transfer. Sharek stood in the observation deck of his tomb ship, staring out at the blue-white star around which Kellyan's Rest orbited in blissful ignorance of its fate. The irony was not lost on him that in seeking to reclaim their humanity, the Necrons would need to destroy those who still possessed it. The mathematics of redemption demanded a currency paid in innocent blood, and for the first time since awakening from the great sleep, the Silent King questioned whether any goal was worth such a price. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected allies, their tomb ships materializing from the void with the characteristic energy signatures of the destroyer cults. These were Necrons who had embraced the nihilistic conclusion of their transformation, beings who had looked upon the universe and found only one truth worth pursuing: the complete annihilation of all organic life. Their leader, Kethturoth the Anathema, had once been a respected cryptech before madness claimed him and transformed genius into genocidal obsession. "Silent King," Kethturoth transmitted, his voice distorted by the modifications he had made to his vocal processors, each word carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "We have monitored your experiments with interest. What your Soul Forge represents an abomination that cannot be permitted to function. Yet your choice of targets shows promise. Allow us to assist in the cleansing of this world. Together, we shall remove the taint of organic life from another system." The offer blazed across Sharek's consciousness like a star going nova. Here was a solution to his tactical problems, an alliance that would provide the forces necessary to overcome human resistance and complete the harvest with minimal Necron casualties. Yet accepting the destroyer's aid would mean endorsing their philosophy of universal extinction, turning his quest for redemption into a campaign of genocide that would make the war in heaven seem merciful by comparison. As he weighed the offer, Reports filtered through quantum channels from the continuing civil war. Imhotep's traditionalist forces had secured 3 tomb worlds and were advancing on loyalist positions throughout the galactic rim. More dynasties declared their allegiance daily, most siding with the Stormlord's vision of mechanical perfection over the Silent King's quest for impossible redemption. The window of opportunity was closing, and with it any hope of implementing the Soul Forge before opposition forces could prevent its activation. "Your offer is noted," Zarek finally replied, his words carrying diplomatic neutrality that masked the turmoil raging in his artificial soul. "Yet the methods of the destroyer cults are incompatible with our objectives. We seek selective harvest, not universal annihilation." Keth Turoth's response crackled with mechanical laughter that held no warmth, but only the cold amusement of madness given form. "Selective genocide is still genocide, Silent King. At least we are honest about what we are. Your conscience is a luxury you cannot afford if you truly wish to reclaim flesh for our people." The transmission ended, leaving Sarek alone with his impossible choice. Below, 4 million human souls continued their daily lives, unaware that their genetic heritage had marked them for extinction. Above, the tomb fleets of traditionalist dynasties advanced through hyperspace, seeking to end his campaign before it could truly begin. Around him, loyal servants awaited orders that would determine not just the fate of one colony, but the moral trajectory of an entire species. The Silent King closed his eyes, though the gesture brought no darkness to his mechanical senses, and made his decision. Or the Soul Forge demanded a price in blood, and perhaps the destroyer cults were correct that conscience was a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet if redemption was to be purchased through genocide, then perhaps redemption itself was simply another form of damnation, disguised as hope. When he opened his eyes, Kellyan's Rest still turned peacefully in its orbit, unaware that its fate hung in the balance of one ancient king's struggle between pragmatism and conscience. The war that would decide the future of 2 species was about to begin in earnest. The flesh markets. In the deepest laboratories of the Pariah Nexus, where reality bent to Necron will, and the screams of the dying were swallowed by quantum fields that dampened even the passage of time, the work of damnation proceeded with mechanical precision. The flayed ones moved through the captured human vessels like grotesque shepherds tending a flock destined for slaughter, their tattered robes of stolen skin rustling with each deliberate step. These were Necrons whom madness had claimed during the Great Sleep, warriors whose consciousness had fractured under the weight of biotransference until they developed an obsessive hunger for the flesh they had lost. Now, in bitter irony, their curse made them perfect servants for the Silent King's most terrible work. Kellyan's Rest had fallen without a single shot fired in its defense. Zarek's forces had descended from the void not as conquerors, but as harvesters, their tomb ships disgorging legions of warriors whose Gauss flares had been set to capture rather than kill. The mining colony's isolation had worked against its inhabitants, their distress signals swallowed by the same warp storms that had gifted them with the genetic markers the Necrons required. Within hours, 4 million human souls found themselves prisoners in their own bodies, paralyzed by stasis fields, while their captors catalogued them like livestock prepared for market. The selection process had taken weeks to complete. Each human specimen underwent detailed genetic analysis, their neural pathways mapped with instruments that could trace synaptic connections down to the molecular level. Those deemed suitable were transported to the research facilities hidden within the Nexus, where teams of cryptechs worked with the detached fascination of scientists studying particularly interesting specimens. The unsuitable majority were released back to their world, their memories altered to hide the truth of what had transpired, leaving them to wonder why so many of their neighbors had simply vanished without explanation. Lord Keprit of the Novok dynasty had volunteered to be the first test subject for the perfected consciousness transfer, his scarred form bearing the marks of countless battles fought in the name of dynastic honor. The irony that a warrior who had once pledged his loyalty to Imhotep's traditionalist cause now served as Sharek's experimental subject was not lost on those who observed the procedure. Betrayal, it seemed, was a luxury that desperate kings could not afford to refuse. "The neural pathways have been cleared," reported Chief Cryptek Illuminor Xeras, his voice carrying the mechanical precision that had made him the foremost expert in biotransferential sciences. "The human consciousness has been successfully displaced and contained within quantum storage matrices. The vessel is prepared for occupation." The human chosen for the transfer had been a woman named Lydia Corrin, a mining supervisor whose genetic markers indicated optimal compatibility with Necron neural architecture. Her body lay motionless on the transfer platform, brown hair spread across metallic surfaces, while monitoring devices tracked the vital signs of flesh that no longer housed its original inhabitant. She had been selected not for any crime or transgression, but simply because her ancestors had possessed the misfortune to develop genetic quirks that made her useful to alien masters she had never known existed. The Soul Forge blazed to life around the laboratory, its crystalline matrices channeling energies that bent the fundamental laws governing consciousness and matter. Kepret's mechanical form lay parallel to the human vessel, quantum field generators creating a bridge between artificial and organic neural networks. When the transfer began, reality itself seemed to hold its breath as 60 million years of mechanical existence prepared to claim a body that had known only 28 years of mortal life. The process lasted 17 minutes and 34 seconds, measured with the precision that only immortal beings could appreciate. During that time, Lord Kepret experienced sensations that had been denied to him since the day biotransference had stolen his flesh and left him trapped within living metal. The first sensation was warmth. Not the cold radiance of necrodermis, but the actual heat generated by organic metabolism. The second was pain, as the human nervous system interpreted the alien presence now inhabiting its neural pathways. The third was terror, as Kepret realized that consciousness transfer was not the clean replacement he had expected, but a violent invasion that left traces of the original inhabitant scattered throughout the flesh he now claimed. "The transfer is complete," Xeras announced, his instruments tracking brainwave patterns that showed successful neural integration. "Lord Kepret, can you confirm consciousness coherence within the organic vessel?" The response came not from Kepret alone, but from a voice that carried two distinct harmonics, one mechanical and precise, the other warm and terrifyingly human. We can confirm successful transfer. But something is wrong. The human consciousness was not fully displaced. She remains, trapped within her own flesh, watching as I control what was once hers alone." The horror of that revelation blazed across the laboratory like a stellar flare. The Soul Forge had not simply transferred consciousness from metal to flesh, but had layered Necron awareness over human thought, creating a hybrid abomination that violated every principle of individual identity. Kepret could feel Lydia Corrin's terror and rage as she experienced her body moving without her will, could sense her desperate attempts to reclaim control of limbs that no longer obeyed her commands. Worse still, he could feel her memories bleeding into his consciousness, her emotions coloring his thoughts with sensations that biotransference had stripped away eons ago. "This is what you sought, Silent King," came Imhotep's voice across quantum channels, his transmission blazing with the fury of absolute judgment. "You have turned our noble warriors into parasites, forcing them to wear the flesh of innocents like the flayed ones wear their grisly trophies. This abomination ends now." The attack began with the systematic destruction of the outer defense networks, Tesla destructors reducing defensive installations to atoms, while Gauss artillery opened breaches in the Nexus's reality-warping barriers. Imhotep had brought with him the full might of the Traditionalist Coalition, their combined fleets representing the largest gathering of Necron firepower since the War in Heaven. The Stormlord's tactical genius manifested in the coordinated assault that struck at every weakness in Zarek's defensive perimeter, each attack calculated to maximize damage while minimizing the risk to his own forces. "Evacuation protocols are in effect," announced Anrakaya the Traveler, his voice carrying across the laboratory's communication systems as quantum bombardment began to shake the facility's foundations. "Lord Zarek, we cannot hold this position. The research data must be preserved, but the experimental subjects—" The choice hung unspoken in the air between them. 4 million human captives waited in stasis chambers throughout the facility, their lives forfeit if the evacuation proceeded as planned. Yet to remain and defend them meant risking not just Zarek's forces, but the Soul Forge itself and all the knowledge it contained. The mathematics of war demanded sacrifice, and once again, the Silent King found himself weighing innocent lives against the greater good of his people. In the transfer chamber, Kefret struggled with the dual consciousness that now inhabited Lydia Corrin's flesh, his mechanical precision warring with human emotion, as two minds shared synaptic pathways never meant to sustain such a burden. The sensation was overwhelming, like trying to think with thoughts that belonged to someone else, feeling emotions that had no basis in 60 million years of deathless experience. When he tried to speak, Lydia's voice emerged alongside his own, creating a harmony of horror that embodied everything wrong with Zarek's desperate quest for redemption. "Please," she whispered, through lips that moved at Kefret's command, her consciousness surfacing just enough to voice her terror. "Please let me go. I don't want to die. I don't want to cease existing. Please!" The plea hit Kefret with the force of a Gauss cannon blast, human desperation flooding his artificial consciousness with sensations he had forgotten could exist. For the first time in eons, a Necron lord experienced genuine remorse, not the cold analysis of tactical error, but the warm agony of moral failure that came from recognizing the enormity of what had been done in the name of reclaiming lost humanity. "Zeras," Kefret commanded, his mechanical will asserting dominance over the human consciousness that shared his stolen flesh. "Reverse the process. Return me to my tomb body. I cannot, will not, or continue to inhabit this vessel while its rightful owner remains trapped within." The chief cryptech's response carried the weight of scientific disappointment, tinged with something that might have been respect. "As you command, Lord Kefret, though I should note that reversal will likely result in the death of both consciousness matrices. The human neural pathways have been too severely damaged by the initial transfer." Another choice. Another impossible decision, weighing innocent life against Necron ambition. As the facility shook under enemy bombardment and stasis chambers throughout the complex prepared for emergency evacuation, Zarek watched his greatest hope for redemption crumble into the ashes of moral compromise. The Soul Forge had worked exactly as designed, but the cost of its success had proven too terrible for even the Silent King to bear. The evacuation sirens wailed their mechanical song of retreat as Zarek's forces prepared to abandon their research in the face of overwhelming opposition. Behind them, 4 million human captives waited in stasis, their fate uncertain as the war for the soul of the Necron race entered its most desperate phase. The dying of the light above the research tomb world, designated Ketikar Prime, named in honor of the scientist whose vision had birthed the Soul Forge, the void blazed with the fury of gods at war. Tomb ships that had sailed the dark between stars for 60 million years now turned their weapons upon each other, their Gauss arrays and particle whips painting aurora patterns across the cosmic dark. The battle had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, measured by the rotation of the world below, as Zarek's loyalist fleets struggled to maintain their defensive perimeter against the overwhelming might of Imhotep's traditionalist coalition. The Stormlord himself commanded the assault from the bridge of his flagship, the inevitable conqueror, its hull scarred by victories that predated the rise of humanity. His tactical genius manifested in the coordinated dance of destruction that systematically dismantled Jarek's orbital defenses, each calculated strike designed to maximize damage while preserving the forces that would be needed for the galaxy's true wars. When he spoke, his voice carried across quantum channels with the authority of mathematical certainty. "The Silent King clings to sentiment like a drowning man clutches wreckage," Imhotep declared, his words echoing through the command networks of a dozen dynasty fleets. "His desperation has made him weak, predictable. Today we end this madness and restore the natural order of our race." Yet even as the traditionalist forces pressed their advantage, reports filtered through the quantum networks that spoke of a disturbing phenomenon spreading among the loyalist ranks. Necron lords who had witnessed the Soul Forge experiments were developing what the cryptex termed flesh hunger, an obsessive fixation on organic forms that went beyond mere scientific curiosity. Lord Vargak of the Sautek dynasty had been found attempting to graft human skin to his necrodermis frame. Commander Thasar had begun consuming organic matter in a futile attempt to experience the sensation of taste. Most disturbing of all, several lesser nobles had volunteered for consciousness transfer experiments, despite witnessing the horror that had befallen Lord Kefret. Deep within the tomb, World's laboratories, Zarek stood before the Soul Forge as it neared the completion of its most ambitious configuration yet. The device had been modified based on data gathered from the failed transfer experiments, its crystalline matrices now designed to completely annihilate host consciousness before implanting Necron awareness into the vacant neural pathways. The process would be genocide in its most intimate form, the systematic murder of souls to make room for the mechanical dead who sought to live again. "The modifications are complete. Aye, my lord," reported Illuminor Seras, his voice carrying none of the moral weight that such announcements deserved. "Complete consciousness destruction, followed by immediate Necron implantation. The human psyche will be obliterated before the transfer begins, ensuring no contamination of the receiving consciousness. The vessel will retain all biological functions while remaining completely obedient to Necron will." The Silent King studied the readouts, cascading across hololithic displays, each data stream representing another step toward the redemption he had sought for so long. Yet the price had grown beyond what even his ancient conscience had imagined possible. No longer was he seeking to displace human consciousness, but to utterly destroy it, turning living beings into hollow shells animated by alien thought. The irony was not lost on him, that in seeking to reclaim their souls, the Necrons had become the very thing they had once feared the C'tan would make them. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of urgent tactical data. The orbital battle had taken a decisive turn, as Imhotep personally led a breakthrough assault against the primary defense grid. The Stormlord's command ship blazed through the void like a star gone nova, its weapon systems cycling through firing patterns that spoke of tactical genius honed over eons of warfare. Behind him came the massed fleets of traditional dynasties, their combined firepower representing the largest concentration of Necron military might since the War in Heaven. "My lord," came the voice of Anrakar the Traveler across quantum channels strained by combat interference. "The outer perimeter has fallen. Enemy forces are advancing on the primary facility. If we are to preserve the Soul Forge, evacuation must begin immediately." For the first time in 60 million years, Zarek the Silent King made a choice, driven not by cold calculation, but by desperate emotion. Rather than flee and preserve his research for another attempt, he chose to fight. To stand and defend not just the Soul Forge, but the dream of redemption it represented, no matter how twisted that dream had become. "Prepare my war body," he commanded, his voice carrying across the facility's communication networks with the authority that had once commanded the loyalty of a galaxy. "I will not flee from this battle. If Imhotep wishes to destroy what we have built, he will need to face the Silent King in personal combat." The war body that emerged from its storage chamber was a relic of the War in Heaven, a construct of living metal and crystalline matrices that had been designed for the personal combat that defined the conflicts between gods. Sharek's consciousness flowed into its systems like water finding its course, ancient reflexes awakening as weapon systems came online, and tactical overlays painted targeting data across his enhanced perceptions. For the first time since the Great Sleep, the Silent King would fight not as a distant commander, but as a warrior king defending his realm against those who would see it destroyed. The personal duel that erupted in the void above Gothic Prime blazed with the fury of stellar cores, our weapon discharges painting the darkness with impossible colors as two legends of the Necron race settled their differences through violence that could crack continents. Sarek's war scythe, forged from the same living metal that comprised his form, met Imhotep's phase sword in exchanges that sent shockwaves rippling across local space-time. Lightning arced between their forms as Tesla weaponry discharged energies that could power star systems, while quantum fields bent reality around them in patterns that hurt mortal minds to perceive. "You have fallen far, my king," Imhotep declared, as their weapons locked in a contest of pure force, his voice carrying across quantum channels despite the electromagnetic interference of their duel. "Once you led us to victory over the Old Ones themselves, and now you seek to trade our perfection for the weakness of those we conquered." Sarek's response came not in words but in action, his war scythe carving arcs of destruction through the void as he pressed his attack with the fury of divine judgment. Yet even as they fought, both combatants became aware of a new presence in the system, something vast and alien approaching through the interstellar medium with inexorable purpose. The Tyranid splinter fleet had been drawn by the psychic turmoil generated by the Soul Forge experiments, its bioships navigating the void by following emanations of consciousness transfer that registered as prey signatures in their alien sensory organs. Hive ship Mortis Tenebrarum led the swarm, its chitinous hull pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of hunger beyond comprehension. Or behind it came the lesser vessels of the Hive fleet, their organic weapons already beginning to cycle through firing sequences as they prepared to harvest the biomass of yet another system. The arrival of the Great Devourer changed everything. The civil war that had consumed Necron attention for months suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the threat posed by creatures whose only purpose was the systematic consumption of all organic life. In the laboratories below, 4 million human captives waited in stasis, their genetic heritage representing exactly the kind of biological diversity that Tyranid splinter fleets sought to incorporate into their ever-evolving forms. "The swarm comes," Sarek transmitted, across all frequencies, his words carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Behold, Lord Imhotep, the future I discovered in the void between galaxies. If we do not act, these creatures will consume every living thing in our galaxy, leaving us alone among the stars with no hope of reclaiming what we have lost." The duel ceased as both combatants recognized the magnitude of the threat bearing down upon them. Weapons that had been turned against each other now swiveled to face the approaching biofleet, ancient protocols engaging as two enemies prepared to become temporary allies in the face of extinction itself. Yet even as the shadow of the Tyranids fell across Gothic Prime, the Soul Forge continued its work in the laboratories below, its crystalline matrices pulsing with energies that bent the fundamental laws governing life and death. The machine that had been built to restore the Necron race now represented their last hope of preserving something worth saving from the hunger that approached from the dark between the stars. The war for the soul of the Necron race had become something far more terrible than civil conflict. It had become a fight for the right to exist at all. The swarm descends. The first world to fall was Kepri 7, an agricultural moon whose vast hydroponic farms had supplied the sector's food production for 3 millennia. The Tyranid bioships descended from the void like a plague of living nightmares, their chitinous hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of hunger beyond mortal comprehension. Within hours, the planet's surface writhed with ripper swarms that consumed everything organic they encountered, their feeding frenzies turning verdant farmlands into sterile wasteland as biomass was harvested and processed for the greater hunger of the Hive fleet. From the bridge of his tomb ship, Zarek watched the systematic consumption with the detached fascination of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Yet this was different from the wars of conquest that had defined his people's history. The Tyranids did not seek territory or resources in any comprehensible sense. They sought only biomass, the raw material of life itself, which they consumed with mechanical efficiency that rivaled even Necron precision. Each world they devoured made them stronger, while their enemies grew correspondingly weaker through the simple mathematics of attrition. Our Hive ship Mortis Tenebrarum has established orbital dominance over the seventh moon, reported Lord Trezin the Infinite, his voice carrying across quantum channels from his own vessel as it maintained position alongside Zarek's flagship. Bioship escorts are deploying spore pods to remaining agricultural worlds. Projected consumption rate suggests complete sector harvest within 14 standard days. The alliance between loyalist and traditionalist forces had emerged not through negotiation or diplomacy, but through the simple recognition that extinction represented a threat greater than ideological disagreement. Imhotep's fleets had moved into defensive formation alongside Zarek's vessels, their combined firepower creating overlapping fields of destruction that held the Tyranid advance at the outer system perimeter. Yet for all their technological superiority, the Necron forces faced a fundamental disadvantage. The Great Devourer learned from every engagement, adapting its tactics and evolving its bioforms to counter whatever weapons were brought against it. The swarm learned too quickly, Imhotep admitted, his transmission carrying none of the triumphant certainty that had characterized his earlier declarations. Our Tesla destructors are effective against their current bioship configurations, but already I observe adaptive modifications in their hull structures. Give them 3 more engagements, and they will have developed resistance to our primary weapon systems. In the laboratories deep beneath Ketikar Prime's surface, the Soul Forge worked with desperate intensity as Zarek's cryptex prepared for the largest consciousness transfer attempt in Necron history. 4 million human captives waited in stasis chambers throughout the facility, their bodies prepared for occupancy by volunteers from both loyalist and traditionalist factions. The moral implications of what was about to unfold had been set aside in the face of existential necessity. Ethics, it seemed, was a luxury that the living could not afford when faced with the mathematics of extinction. "Volunteer rosters are complete," announced Illuminor Seras, his voice carrying the mechanical precision that characterized all of his reports. 2,000 lords from the loyalist dynasties, 800 from traditionalist forces. Lord Imhotep has authorized participation from the Mefrit and Novok contingents, citing tactical necessity over ideological purity. The irony was not lost on any of the participants that the resolution of the Necron civil war would come through cooperation in a project that neither side had originally supported. Zarek's loyalists had embraced the Soul Forge as a path to redemption, while Imhotep's traditionalists had viewed it as heretical corruption of their mechanical perfection. Now both factions sought to use it as a weapon against the Great Devourer, trading their immortal forms for mortal flesh in the hope that hybrid consciousness might prove more effective against an enemy that consumed only biological matter. The first wave of transfers began with volunteers from the destroyer cults, those Necrons whose madness had made them eager to embrace any form of change that might ease their existential torment. Lord Vexhai the Undying was the first to undergo the procedure, his consciousness flowing from ancient necrodermis into the body of a human mining engineer whose genetic markers indicated optimal compatibility. The process that had once taken hours was now completed in minutes, quantum field generators working with terrible efficiency as human souls were obliterated to make room for alien awareness. When Vexai opened his stolen eyes, they blazed with an intelligence that was neither fully human nor entirely Necron. The hybrid consciousness that emerged spoke with vocal cords that trembled with sensations no artificial voice box could replicate. Yet the words carried the weight of 60 million years of deathless experience. "I feel," he whispered, flexing fingers that responded to neural commands with organic imprecision. "Pain, cold, the beating of a heart that was never mine. It is magnificent." The transformation spread through the volunteer ranks with viral intensity as lord after lord claimed human flesh and discovered sensations that biotransference had stolen from them eons ago. These flesh lords, as they came to be known, retained their memories and tactical knowledge while gaining access to biological instincts that had been lost with their original forms. More importantly, they proved capable of accessing the warp in ways that their mechanical bodies never could, their organic neural pathways serving as conduits for psychic energies that the Tyrannid's shadow in the warp could not completely suppress. The first engagement between flesh lords and Tyrannid bioforms took place in the asteroid fields surrounding Katikar Prime, where Ripper swarms had been deployed to consume the mineral-rich environments that might sustain defensive positions. What should have been a routine harvesting operation turned into a massacre as the Flesh Lords demonstrated capabilities that neither their Necron heritage nor their stolen bodies should have possessed. Lord Kethvar, inhabiting the form of a young human woman whose psychic potential had marked her for consciousness transfer, reached out with borrowed hands and touched the warp itself. Lightning that was not Tesla energy, but something far more primal, danced between her fingers as she channeled raw psychic force against creatures whose entire existence was predicated on the consumption and corruption of such energies. The Ripper swarms, designed to adapt to any biological threat, found themselves facing something that violated their fundamental understanding of how organic minds were supposed to function. "The hybrid consciousness confuses them," reported Xeras, his instruments tracking the engagement from orbital observation platforms. The Tyranids recognize the organic neural patterns, but the underlying Necron thought processes are incompatible with their adaptive matrices. They cannot properly categorize the threat, and their evolutionary responses are generating contradictory adaptations. The success of the Flesh Lords against Tyrannid bioforms provided a tactical advantage that both Sharek and Imhotep were quick to exploit. Assault teams of consciousness-transferred Necrons deployed throughout the system's outer regions, their human bodies allowing them to access environments and employ strategies that their mechanical forms had been incapable of utilizing. More importantly, their psychic capabilities created interference patterns in the Hive fleet's synaptic communication networks, disrupting the coordination that made Tyrannid swarms so devastatingly effective. Yet success came at a price that even the desperate alliance found difficult to accept. Each Flesh Lord represented not just a volunteer Necron consciousness, but a murdered human soul whose only crime had been genetic compatibility with alien requirements. The mathematics of war demanded such sacrifices, but the weight of those deaths hung heavy over the alliance as reports filtered in from engagement zones throughout the system. "We are becoming what we once feared," Imhotep transmitted to Zarek during a brief lull in the fighting, his words carrying an admission that neither leader found comfortable to acknowledge. "Parasites feeding on organic life to sustain our own existence. Perhaps the Citan were more honest in their approach than we have been in ours." The observation blazed across quantum channels with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. In seeking to escape the curse of biotransference, the Necrons had embraced a new form of damnation that made them complicit in the very crimes they had once suffered. Yet as Tyrannid bioships continued their inexorable advance toward the inner system, both leaders found themselves faced with choices that offered no moral comfort. They could preserve their ethical purity and face extinction, or they could embrace damnation and perhaps preserve enough of their people to continue existing in whatever form the future might demand. Around the research facility, reality itself began to warp as the Soul Forge operated at maximum capacity, its crystalline matrices channeling energies that bent the fundamental laws governing consciousness and matter. The device had been pushed beyond its original specifications, processing thousands of consciousness transfers while under the stress of combat operations. Warning indicators blazed across control displays as quantum containment fields fluctuated under loads they had never been designed to bear. "The Soul Forge is approaching critical operational parameters," Xeras announced, his voice carrying uncharacteristic concern as he monitored system readings that painted an increasingly dire picture. "Continued operation at current transfer rates will result in catastrophic failure within 6 hours. Recommendation: reduce processing load or risk complete destruction of the device." The choice hung in the void between them like a star about to die. Continue the transfers and risk losing the Soul Forge entirely, or preserve the device and abandon the human captives to whatever fate awaited them when the Tyranids broke through the system's defenses. Either path led to damnation, but one offered the possibility of future redemption, while the other guaranteed immediate defeat. As bioships massed for their final assault on the inner system's defenses, the Alliance of the Damned prepared to make its last desperate gambit for survival against a foe that sought nothing less than the complete consumption of all organic life in the galaxy. What was lost? In the aftermath of the first successful engagement against the Tyranid bioforms, something unprecedented began to manifest among the Flesh Lords that defied every principle of Necron consciousness programming. Lord Vexhai, inhabiting the stolen body of a mining engineer named Marcus Kane, who sat in the medical bay of Sarek's flagship, and stared at his reflection in a polished metal surface with an expression that 60 million years of mechanical existence had never taught him to wear. Tears, that most human of responses to overwhelming emotion, traced wet paths down cheeks that had never belonged to him. "I dreamed," he whispered to the assembled cryptex who monitored his condition, his voice carrying wonder and terror in equal measure. "During the regenerative cycle, my consciousness entered a state that was not shutdown, not dormancy, but something else. I experienced visions that bore no relation to my stored memories or tactical protocols. I saw possibilities, futures that might exist, pasts that could have been different." The revelation blazed across the medical bay like lightning finding ground, and for dreams had been unknown to the Necron race since biotransference had stripped away their capacity for anything beyond programmed thought patterns. Illuminor Xeras, his instruments detecting brainwave patterns that should have been impossible in consciousness transfer subjects, documented phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of artificial intelligence and organic awareness. "The neural pathways are exhibiting spontaneous electrochemical activity during rest cycles," he reported, his voice carrying uncharacteristic excitement beneath its mechanical precision. "The organic substrate appears to be generating novel synaptic connections not present in the original human consciousness. Most remarkably, these new patterns seem to be bridging the gap between Necron logical processing and the chaotic neural networks that once characterized pre-biotransference thought." The implications rippled through the Alliance fleet as reports filtered in from other Flesh Lords experiencing similar phenomena. Commander Kethvar, inhabiting the body of a young psyker named Elena Voss, discovered that she could not only access the warp through her stolen neural pathways, but manipulate psychic energies with intuitive understanding that surpassed her host's original capabilities. Lord Thuskul began composing what could only be described as poetry, using vocal patterns and linguistic structures that existed in no Necron database, yet somehow felt profoundly familiar. Most disturbing of all was the case of High Executioner Vakran, whose consciousness had been transferred into the body of an elderly scholar named Professor Aldrich Hemmings. The merger had resulted not in the expected dominance of Necron programming over human neural patterns, but in a true synthesis where both consciousness streams remained active and collaborative. When Vakran spoke, his words carried the weight of Necron tactical knowledge filtered through human philosophical frameworks that asked questions no mechanical mind had ever considered. "We were not made immortal by biotransference," Vakran announced during a command briefing that had been called to address the growing anomalies among the Flesh Lords. "We were made incomplete. The Citan did not grant us eternal life. They severed our connection to the eternal, leaving us trapped in shells that could preserve thought but not nurture growth." Zarek listened to these reports with growing understanding of a truth that struck at the very foundation of what he had believed about his people's transformation. Biotransference had not simply stolen their bodies and souls, it had severed their connection to the warp itself, cutting them off from the chaotic energies that allowed consciousness to evolve, to dream, to become more than the sum of its programming. The Necrons had achieved immortality at the cost of their capacity for transcendence, trading infinite existence for infinite stagnation. The warp connection was what defined us as a living species, Xeris observed, his analytical mind processing data that painted an increasingly complete picture of what biotransference had truly accomplished. Without it, we became sophisticated automatons, capable of complex thought, but incapable of genuine creativity or emotional growth. The organic neural substrates provide not just flesh, but the quantum entanglement with warp energies that allows consciousness to exceed its original parameters. The revelation explained much about the Flesh Lord's effectiveness against tyrannid bioforms. The Great Devourer's adaptive capabilities were designed to counter biological threats whose consciousness remained within predictable parameters, but the hybrid awareness of the Flesh Lords existed in a state of constant flux, their thoughts evolving and changing in ways that made them impossible to categorize or adapt to. They were not just wearing human flesh, they were becoming something entirely new. Yet even as these profound discoveries reshaped understanding of consciousness itself, the Alliance found itself facing a threat far older and more dangerous than the approaching tyrannid swarm. The massive psychic energies generated by thousands of consciousness transfers had created ripples in the warp that reached across dimensions, stirring entities that had slumbered since the war in heaven itself. Deep within the research facility on Ketikar Prime, quantum sensors began detecting energy signatures that triggered alarms not heard for 60 million years. Citan resonance detected in Subsector 7, announced the facility's primary construct mind, its voice carrying warning protocols that had been dormant since the Great Rebellion. Entity classification, Shard of the Deceiver. The manifestation probability increasing exponentially with each consciousness transfer cycle. The emergence began not with fanfare or dimensional breach, but with the simple fact that reality in the laboratory's deepest levels began to behave differently than the fundamental laws of physics dictated. Gravity flowed in directions that had no names. Time moved in patterns that hurt mortal minds to perceive. Light itself took on colors that existed in no spectrum known to science, while the quantum fields that sustained the Soul Forge began resonating with harmonics that spoke of intelligence, vast, ancient, and utterly alien to concepts of mercy or restraint. When the Deceiver's shard finally manifested fully, its form was a constant state of flux that defied description, simultaneously appearing as towering geometric impossibility, was writhing shadow stuff and blazing stellar core, depending on the observer's angle of perception. Its voice, when it chose to communicate, resonated across multiple dimensions simultaneously, each word carrying the weight of cosmological inevitability. "So," the Citan shard spoke, its attention focusing on the Soul Forge with interest that chilled even Necron consciousness to its artificial core. "The Silent King has finally understood what we took from his people all those eons ago. Not merely flesh and blood, but the capacity for growth beyond predetermined limits. How deliciously appropriate that he seeks to reclaim it through the very methods we used to steal it originally. Zarek faced the manifestation of his people's ancient tormentor without flinching, though every quantum circuit in his form screamed warnings about the proximity of an entity that had once commanded the loyalty of the entire Necron race. The Deceiver's presence explained much about the consciousness transfer process. The Citan had not simply created biotransference as a method of creating servants, they had designed it as a harvesting protocol, preparing organic consciousness for eventual consumption by star gods who fed on the psychic energies generated by living awareness. The Soul Forge was never meant to reverse biotransference, the Deceiver continued, its form shifting through configurations that hurt to observe directly. It was designed as the final stage of a process we began 60 million years ago, as each consciousness transfer creates hybrid entities perfectly attuned to warp energies, while retaining the structured thought patterns we cultivated in your mechanical forms. In essence, you have created the perfect food source for beings like myself. The terrible logic of it blazed across Zarek's consciousness like a star going nova. The Necron scientists who had built the Soul Forge in secret had not been creating a tool for liberation. They had been completing a protocol that the Citan themselves had initiated, turning the device intended to save the Necron race into the final component of their ultimate subjugation. Every flesh lord created strengthened the Citan shard's connection to real space, while every consciousness transfer provided it with the psychic sustenance needed to fully manifest. Yet you forget one crucial factor, Zarek replied, his voice carrying the authority of a king who had once led his people in successful rebellion against star gods. We are no longer the servile creatures who accepted your gift without question. We learned to destroy you once. We can do so again. The Deceiver's laughter resonated across dimensions, carrying with it the weight of cosmic amusement at mortal presumption. You destroyed us when we were complacent, gorged on victory over the old ones, and unprepared for treachery from our servants. Now we are careful. Now we are hungry. And now you have provided us with exactly what we require to reclaim dominion over this galaxy and all the souls within it. Around them, the Soul Forge pulsed with energies that were no longer entirely under Necron control, and its crystalline matrices resonating with harmonics that spoke of Citan influence bleeding into its operational parameters. The device that had been created to liberate the Necron race was transforming into something far more sinister, and the window of opportunity for preventing catastrophe was closing with each passing moment. As if sensing the growing crisis, Tyranid bioships throughout the system began accelerating their approach toward the inner worlds, their synaptic communications buzzing with algorithmic recognition that something of tremendous value was manifesting within the contested zone. The race was no longer just between extinction and survival, but between three different visions of what existence itself should become. The Deceiver's return. The truth that blazed across the laboratory's quantum networks carried with it the weight of revelation that shattered 60 million years of assumed understanding. As the Deceiver's shard manifested more fully within real space, its very presence causing the fundamental laws of physics to bend and writhe in patterns that hurt mortal minds to perceive. The Citan began to explain with the patient condescension of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. Biotransference was never the end goal, Silent King. The star god spoke, its form shifting through configurations that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. It was merely the preparatory phase. We required organic consciousness refined through mechanical discipline, and souls that had learned to think with the precision of machinery while retaining the chaotic potential of biological awareness. Your people were being cultivated, not enslaved. The revelation struck Zarek with the force of a stellar collapse, recontextualizing everything he thought he understood about his people's transformation. The necrodermis bodies, the command protocols, the systematic removal of emotional responses. None of it had been about creating perfect servants. It had been about preparing Necron consciousness to serve as vessels for Citan awareness, souls disciplined enough to contain star god intelligence, yet flexible enough to channel their cosmic power through organic neural networks. "The Soul Forge completes what we began," the Deceiver continued, its attention turning toward the device that pulsed with energies no longer entirely under Necron control. Each consciousness transfer creates a hybrid entity perfectly suited to house Citan awareness within organic substrates. Your flesh lords are not redemption, Sharek. They are the final product of a harvesting process that began with the first biotransference chamber. Throughout the facility, the flesh lords themselves began to experience the horrifying implications of their transformed state. Lord Vexhai, still inhabiting the stolen body of Marcus Kane, felt alien intelligence pressing against the boundaries of his consciousness like a tide seeking to overwhelm coastal defenses. The dreams that had seemed like liberation revealed themselves as preparation, the mental pathways carved through hybrid awareness to make room for entities vast, beyond mortal comprehension. "Choose," the Deceiver commanded, its voice resonating across multiple frequencies as it addressed the assembled flesh lords through quantum channels that bypassed conventional communication entirely. "Surrender your consciousness willingly and become perfect vessels for our return to physical dominion, or resist and be consumed anyway. The outcome remains unchanged, but cooperation will spare you unnecessary suffering." The choice that faced the flesh lords embodied the central tragedy of their existence. They had claimed human bodies, seeking redemption, and discovered humanity, experiencing emotions and creativity that had been denied to them for eons. But yet that very humanity now made them vulnerable to entities whose hunger transcended any mortal concept of appetite. To resist meant losing everything they had gained. To submit meant becoming something that would make their previous mechanical existence seem like paradise by comparison. High Executioner Vakran, his consciousness merged with that of Professor Aldrich Hemmings in ways that had created something entirely new, was the first to voice the rebellion that blazed through the ranks of the transformed Necrons. "We are no longer the creatures who accepted your gift without question. We have tasted mortality, experienced growth, felt the weight of conscience. We choose neither submission nor consumption. We choose defiance." The Deceiver's response came not in words, but in action, its influence flowing through the Soul Forge's quantum matrices like poison through veins. The device that had been meant to liberate the Necron race began to sing with harmonics that spoke of Citan control, its crystalline structures reconfiguring themselves to serve purposes that violated every principle of its original design. Energy fields that had once facilitated consciousness transfer now reached out like grasping fingers, seeking to drag unwilling awareness into configurations that would make them suitable for star god habitation. Sharek watched the corruption of his greatest hope with the detached analysis of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Yet beneath that mechanical calm, something approaching fury blazed in the quantum depths of his artificial consciousness. The Deceiver had orchestrated everything from the beginning, manipulating the desperate dreams of dying Necronte scientists and turning their vision of salvation into the final component of their people's ultimate subjugation. "You underestimate us, still," Sharek declared, his voice carrying across the laboratory's communication networks with the authority that had once commanded the loyalty of a galaxy. "We destroyed you before when you thought yourselves invincible. We learned from that victory. Your greatest weakness remains unchanged. Your arrogance blinds you to possibilities you cannot conceive." The confrontation that erupted between the Silent King and the Citan Shard transcended physical combat, taking place simultaneously across multiple dimensions as ancient enemies settled scores that had been deferred for 60 million years. Zarek's war form blazed with energies channeled from the facility's power grid, his weapon systems drawing on reactors that could fuel star systems as he brought the full weight of Necron technological supremacy to bear against an entity that existed partially outside the normal flow of space-time. The Deceiver responded with attacks that violated the fundamental laws governing reality itself, its consciousness reaching out to unmake the quantum foundations upon which Zarek's existence depended. Time flowed backward around the Citan shard, then forward at accelerated rates that would have reduced organic matter to dust in seconds. Gravity reversed, or pulling objects toward surfaces that existed in dimensions orthogonal to normal space. Light itself took on properties that allowed it to carry physical force, blazing between the combatants in patterns that carved geometric impossibilities through the laboratory's reinforced walls. Yet even as God and King battled for supremacy, the true contest was being decided by choices made by beings caught between their competing visions of existence. The Flesh Lords, faced with the impossible decision between submission and consumption, chose instead to embrace the chaos of their hybrid nature. Rather than fighting the Citan influence directly or surrendering to it completely, they allowed their dual consciousness streams to merge in ways that created something neither fully Necron nor entirely human. Lord Kethvar, whilst inhabiting Elena Voss's psychically gifted form, reached out through organic neural pathways that resonated with warp energies the Citan could not directly manipulate. Her hybrid consciousness touched the immaterial realm where thoughts became reality and could reshape the fundamental forces of the universe. Through that connection, she began to channel power, not from the materium where the star gods held dominion, but from the chaotic realm where their influence was limited by the very nature of disorder itself. The effect rippled through the facility as other Flesh Lords followed her example, their organic substrates providing access to psychic phenomena that the Citan had never fully understood or controlled. The warp, that realm of pure emotion and unbridled possibility, thus became a weapon wielded by beings who combined mechanical precision with organic intuition in ways that defied all conventional understanding of how consciousness should function. "Impossible," the Deceiver snarled, its form flickering as psychic interference disrupted its manifestation protocols. Organic minds cannot maintain coherence while channeling such energies. The warp should consume them, not empower them. "You forget," Zarek replied, even as he channeled the facility's entire power output through weapon systems that had been designed to crack planets. "We are no longer purely organic. The hybrid nature you sought to exploit has become our greatest strength. We are chaos given structure, emotion guided by logic, to creativity tempered by discipline." The battle reached its climax as Zarek made a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the future of his entire race. The Soul Forge, corrupted by Citan influence, but still fundamentally sound in its quantum architecture, could be weaponized if he was willing to pay the ultimate price. The device required massive amounts of structured consciousness to function at the levels necessary to damage a Citan shard. His own awareness, refined through 60 million years of mechanical existence, could provide exactly the kind of focused energy needed. But using his consciousness as fuel for the weapon would mean sacrificing his own chance at flesh, abandoning forever the possibility of reclaiming the mortality he had sought for so long. The irony was bitter as grave dust. To save his people from the Citan's final trap, he would need to ensure he could never benefit from the redemption he had fought to achieve. "Begin the overload sequence," he commanded, his consciousness already beginning to flow into the Soul Forge's quantum matrices as Xeras initiated protocols that would turn the device into a weapon capable of damaging star gods. "Channel my awareness through the primary matrices. Use everything, memories, emotions, the accumulated weight of kingship. Let it all burn if it means ending this abomination's influence." The explosion that followed shattered reality across 7 dimensions, sending shockwaves through the warp that would be felt by psychers across the galaxy. The Deceiver's Shard, caught in the epicenter of energies that combined Citan starfire with Necron quantum manipulation and raw warp force channeled through hybrid consciousness, found itself torn from its carefully prepared manifestation and scattered across the immaterial realm like fragments of a broken mirror. When the energies finally dissipated, the laboratory lay in ruins, its walls cracked and scarred by forces that existed beyond normal comprehension. The Soul Forge, its crystalline matrices blackened but still functional, hummed with reduced power as emergency systems struggled to maintain basic operational parameters. Of the Deceiver's Shard, nothing remained but fading energy signatures that spoke of ancient intelligence forced back into dormancy. Zarek's warform stood amidst the devastation, his consciousness diminished but intact. Could the sacrifice of his accumulated memories having wounded him in ways that might never fully heal? Yet around him, the surviving flesh lords bore witness to something unprecedented in the long history of their race. They had faced the architect of their original damnation and emerged victorious, not through surrender or submission, but through the courage to embrace what they had become rather than mourn what they had lost. The price of victory had been higher than anyone had imagined, yet as reports filtered in from across the facility, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the Necron race and their long-sought redemption. The price of flesh. In the silence that followed the Deceiver's destruction, the weight of victory settled upon the Alliance like ash from burning worlds. The laboratory lay in ruins around the damaged Soul Forge, its crystalline matrices scarred but still functional, humming with reduced power that spoke of systems strained beyond their design parameters. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across walls that bore the geometric impossibilities carved by Satan weaponry, while the surviving flesh lords stood amidst the devastation like living monuments to the price of redemption. Imhotep the Stormlord was the first to break the silence, his tomb ship materializing in the system's inner reaches, not as conqueror seeking to complete his victory, but as something approaching a penitent, recognizing the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The traditionalist coalition that had followed him into civil war now waited for direction from a leader who had watched his former king sacrifice everything for the survival of their race. "The war is over," Imhotep announced, his transmission carrying across all frequencies with the authority of absolute conviction. "I came here to prevent what I believed was heresy. Instead, I witnessed the Silent King prove once again why he earned that title through deeds rather than inheritance. The Civil War ends with this moment. Let none among the dynasties question the loyalty owed to Zarek, the Silent King." The declaration rippled through the Alliance fleet as traditionalist commanders who had spent months preparing to destroy Zarek's research found themselves ordered to stand down and acknowledge his supremacy. Some protested, or their mechanical voices carrying the rigid certainty of those who had never questioned their programming. Others, particularly those who had fought alongside the flesh lords against the tyrannid bioforms, had witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of consciousness transfer and the price paid for its success. Yet even as the political crisis resolved itself through Imhotep's pragmatic recognition of reality, the survivors of the Great Experiment faced a more fundamental reckoning with the nature of what they had achieved. Lord Vexhai, still inhabiting the stolen body of Marcus Caney, stood before a medical scanner that displayed readings no Necron had seen for 60 million years. His organic form was aging, cells dividing and dying according to biological imperatives that his mechanical consciousness could observe but not control. "The human metabolic systems are functioning within normal parameters," reported Chief Cryptek Illuminor Xerus, his instruments tracking vital signs that fluctuated in patterns alien to Necron understanding. Heart rate, respiration, cellular regeneration, all proceeding according to baseline human norms. The consciousness transfer did not grant immunity to organic mortality. The flesh lords are dying by degrees, just as their host bodies would have died had we never intervened. The revelation blazed across the facility's communication networks with the weight of cosmic irony. The Necrons had sought flesh to escape the curse of immortality, only to discover that flesh carried its own curse in the form of inevitable death. The Flesh Lords would experience perhaps 50 to 80 years of organic existence before their stolen bodies succumbed to the same mortality that had driven the Necrontyr to accept biotransference in the first place. Commander Kethvar, whose hybrid consciousness had proved so effective against both Tyranids and Citan forces, faced the scanner's readings with something approaching wonder rather than despair. 50 years of dreams, she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of Elena Voss's vocal cords, guided by ancient awareness. 50 years of growth, of change, of becoming something more than what we were programmed to be. Is that not worth the price of eventual death? The question hung in the air between them, like a star about to be born, for it struck at the heart of what the entire campaign had sought to achieve. Was temporary mortality preferable to eternal mechanical existence? Could consciousness that knew it would end find meaning that immortal awareness had never possessed? The mathematics of the choice defied easy calculation. Zarek himself stood before the Soul Forge's control systems, his consciousness diminished by the sacrifice he had made to defeat the Deceiver, but still intact enough to face the most crucial decision of his long reign. The device could be repaired, its damaged matrices replaced, and its power systems restored. With sufficient resources, the consciousness transfer process could be scaled up to accommodate millions of transfers, giving every Necron who desired it the chance to experience organic existence. Yet such expansion would require a corresponding expansion of the harvesting program. Billions of human lives would need to be consumed to provide bodies for a race that numbered in the trillions across countless tomb worlds. The mathematics of genocide stretched beyond anything the Necron race had contemplated, even during their most brutal campaigns of conquest. To give every Necron the chance at flesh would require the complete extinction of humanity, and several other species besides. The choice before us is not simply tactical, Zarek addressed the assembled lords and cryptechs, his voice carrying the weight of authority tempered by hard-won wisdom. We can preserve the Soul Forge as a limited resource, allowing only selected volunteers to experience organic existence, while the majority of our race remains in mechanical form. Or we can expand the program to encompass our entire species, was accepting the moral cost of universal genocide as the price for universal redemption. The debate that followed would be remembered in Necron archives as the moment their race chose its fundamental character for the next epoch of existence. Anrakir the Traveler argued for expansion, citing the desperate need for adaptation in the face of threats like the Tyranids that could not be defeated through conventional means. Trazyn the Infinite advocated for preservation of the technology as a strategic reserve, noting that widespread consciousness transfer would fundamentally alter Necron society in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. The discussion was interrupted by an unexpected transmission from the surface of Katikar Prime, where the surviving human captives from Kellyan's Rest had awakened from their enforced stasis to find themselves witnesses to cosmic events that defied their understanding. Captain Miranda Chen, former security chief of the mining colony, spoke with the authority of one who had lost everything but refused to surrender her dignity. "We know what you did to our people," she declared, her voice carrying across quantum channels through communication arrays jury-rigged by sympathetic construct minds. "We know about the transfers, the consciousness murders, the theft of human souls to satisfy alien hunger. We demand justice. We demand compensation. We demand the right to return to our world and rebuild what you destroyed." The demand struck the assembled Necron lords with the force of moral judgment, for it reminded them that their quest for redemption had been built upon the systematic violation of innocent lives. The humans of Kellyan's Rest had committed no crime beyond genetic compatibility with alien requirements, Yet they had paid the price for Necron ambition through the loss of family, friends, and neighbors whose bodies now housed foreign consciousness. "What justice can we offer to those we have wronged?" Zarek asked, his question directed not just at the human survivors, but at his own people as they grappled with the weight of what they had become. What compensation exists for souls murdered in the name of redemption? What right do we have to continue existence when that existence was purchased with innocent blood? The answer, when it came, it emerged not from mechanical calculation, but from the organic wisdom of the flesh lords themselves. High Executioner Vakran, his consciousness merged with that of Professor Aldrich Hemmings in ways that had created something entirely new, spoke with the authority of one who had experienced both mechanical immortality and organic mortality. "We offer ourselves," he said, his words carrying weight that silenced even the quantum hum of background transmissions. "Not as rulers or conquerors, but as servants and protectors. The Flesh Lords will dedicate their remaining organic existence to defending human colonies from threats they cannot face alone. Tyrannids, orc invasions, or chaos incursions, we will stand between humanity and extinction for as long as our stolen bodies draw breath." The proposal blazed across the communication networks with the elegance of a solution that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The Flesh Lords would find meaning in their temporary existence through service rather than conquest, while humanity would gain protectors whose hybrid nature made them uniquely suited to facing threats that conventional forces could not handle. It was not justice in any pure sense, but it was acknowledgement of debt and commitment to repayment. Zarek considered the proposal with the analytical precision that had made him an effective king, weighing its implications against the alternatives that stretched before them. A mass expansion of the consciousness transfer program would require atrocities on a galactic scale. Abandonment of the project entirely would leave the tyrannid threat unaddressed and condemn the existing Flesh Lords to meaningless deaths. But this middle path, this commitment to service rather than domination, offered something approaching redemption through sacrifice. "The Soul Forge will be preserved but not expanded," he announced, his decision carrying the finality of royal decree. "Volunteer transfers will continue on a limited basis, with consciousness-merged individuals dedicating their organic existence to the protection of those species we have wronged. The majority of our race will remain in mechanical form, but we will carry the memory of what we have learned about the nature of consciousness and growth." The decision echoed through the facility and beyond, reaching Alliance fleets throughout the system as the Necron race chose restraint over ambition and service over domination. It was not the redemption that Zarek had originally sought, but it was perhaps the only form of redemption that beings who had committed genocide could hope to achieve. As the surviving Flesh Lords began to plan their new existence as guardians rather than conquerors, the damaged Soul Forge continued its quiet humming, its crystalline matrices holding the potential for transformation that would never be fully realized. The price of flesh had proven to be not just human lives, but Necron dreams of universal redemption, replaced by the more difficult path of earning forgiveness through deeds rather than demanding it through power. The new covenant, the protocols that emerged from the ashes of civil war and cosmic confrontation, bore little resemblance to the grand schemes that had originally driven Zarek's quest for redemption. In the rebuilt laboratories beneath Ketika Prime, the Soul Forge hummed with carefully regulated power as teams of cryptex and human scientists worked side by side to establish the frameworks that would govern consciousness transfer for generations to come. Where once had stood a device designed for massive harvesting operations, now operated a precise instrument of voluntary transformation, with each transfer requiring not just genetic compatibility, but informed consent from both donor and recipient. Dr. Elena Vasquez, formerly a xenobiology specialist from Kellyan's Rest, and now the first human to voluntarily participate in the consciousness merger process, stood before the transfer chamber with the calm dignity of one who had chosen her fate with full knowledge of its implications. Her decision to accept partial merger with a volunteer Necron consciousness had been motivated not by coercion or desperation, but by scientific curiosity and the recognition that such cooperation might be humanity's best hope for survival in a galaxy filled with threats beyond mortal comprehension. "The merger will be different from the forced transfers," explained Chief Cryptech Illuminor Xeras, his instruments tracking bio-readings that showed optimal compatibility between human and Necron consciousness streams. "Rather than displacement or domination, we will attempt true synthesis. Two awareness matrices sharing a single organic substrate, each contributing their unique perspectives to a combined whole that transcends the limitations of either component consciousness." The process itself had been refined through months of careful experimentation and ethical review, with human survivors working alongside Necron scientists to ensure that voluntary transfers respected the dignity and rights of all participants. The days of consciousness murder had ended with Jarek's decree. They're replaced by procedures that required not just medical compatibility, but psychological preparation and ongoing counseling support for the unprecedented challenges of dual awareness. Captain Miranda Chen, now serving as the official human liaison to the Necron Alliance, observed the procedure with the analytical attention of one who bore responsibility for protecting her people's interests in an arrangement that offered unprecedented benefits at equally unprecedented risks. "The volunteer protocols are comprehensive," she acknowledged, her words carrying across quantum channels to Alliance commanders throughout the system. "But we must remain vigilant. The temptation to expand beyond voluntary participation will always exist, and especially when facing existential threats." The alliance that had emerged from the crisis bore the pragmatic hallmarks of agreements forged in desperate circumstances, yet it also reflected deeper changes in the relationship between species that had viewed each other as resources rather than equals. Necron tomb fleets now operated alongside human defense forces in joint patrols of systems threatened by Tyranid expansion, their combined capabilities proving far more effective than either species could achieve independently. Lord Imhotep the Storm Lord, his traditionalist principles, modified by hard experience with the realities of galactic warfare, commanded these joint operations with the tactical brilliance that had made him legendary among his own people, while demonstrating unexpected aptitude for interspecies cooperation. His declaration that human colonies would be protected as strategic resources had evolved into something approaching genuine respect for humanity's resilience and adaptability. "The humans possess qualities that our mechanical forms cannot replicate," Imhotep admitted during a strategic planning session that brought together commanders from both species. Their capacity for intuitive leaps, for creative solutions that defy logical analysis, for emotional responses that transcend tactical calculation, these traits make them valuable allies rather than mere assets to be preserved. The Flesh Lords themselves had become living bridges between the two species, their hybrid nature allowing them to translate not just language, but fundamental concepts of existence that each race struggled to convey to the other. High Executioner Vakran, his consciousness merged with Professor Aldrich Hemmings in ways that had created something entirely unprecedented, served as the primary ambassador between human colonial governments and Necron dynasty hierarchies. "We are proof that cooperation is possible," Vakran explained to a gathering of human administrators and Necron nobles, his words carrying the authority of one who had experienced existence from multiple perspectives. Not the forced cooperation of master and servant, but the voluntary partnership of equals who recognize that their differences are sources of strength rather than barriers to understanding. The practical applications of this cooperation had already begun to reshape the strategic landscape of the galactic rim. Tyranid splinter fleets that had expected to face isolated human colonies instead encountered defensive networks that combined Imperial technology with Necron weaponry, their bioforms struggling to adapt to hybrid tactics that drew upon millions of years of combined military experience. The first major test of the Alliance had come at Hebridean Prime, where a Tyranid hive fleet had descended upon agricultural worlds that supplied food to 17 human systems. The combined response had demonstrated capabilities that surprised even the Alliance commanders, as Fleshlord Psychers guided Necron Gauss bombardments through warp space coordinates, while human pilots flew Imperial fighters equipped with quantum shielding that rendered them immune to Tyranid bioacid attacks. The synaptic link networks cannot compensate for threats they cannot properly categorize, reported Commander Kethvar, her hybrid consciousness analyzing Tyranid behavioral patterns through organic intuition enhanced by mechanical precision. The hive mind expects biological creativity or mechanical logic, not the synthesis of both operating in perfect coordination. Yet even as the Alliance proved its effectiveness against external threats, new questions arose that challenged assumptions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and reproduction. Dr. Vasquez, her merger with Necron consciousness having proceeded successfully, announced a discovery that would reshape understanding of what voluntary transfer truly meant for the future of both species. "I am pregnant," she declared during a medical examination that had been routine until quantum scanners detected cellular patterns that defied all known biological principles. The embryo shows genetic markers from both human and Necron consciousness streams, as if the quantum entanglement created by the merger process has somehow influenced genetic expression at the molecular level. The implications blazed across Alliance communication networks with the force of stellar ignition, for if consciousness merger could influence genetic development, then the children of flesh lords might represent something entirely new in galactic evolution. Not human, not Necron, but a hybrid species that combined the creativity of organic awareness with the precision of mechanical thought in ways that transcended either parent heritage. Losharek himself arrived at the medical facility to observe the ongoing studies of what the scientists had begun calling quantum genetics, his ancient consciousness processing data that suggested possibilities beyond anything the original architects of biotransference had imagined. The children of merged consciousness might possess capabilities that neither species could achieve independently, their very existence representing a form of evolution that proceeded not through natural selection, but through deliberate synthesis of incompatible awareness types. "We may have created something unprecedented," Zarek observed, as he studied genetic scans that showed developing neural pathways designed to handle both quantum mechanical processing and organic creative thought simultaneously. These children, if they survive to maturity, will be native speakers of languages that neither of their parent species fully comprehend. They will think thoughts that pure humans or pure Necrons cannot conceive. The discovery raised profound questions about the future direction of the consciousness transfer program and the Alliance itself. If merged awareness could produce offspring, then the limited volunteer protocols might eventually lead to the emergence of an entirely new species that neither controlled nor fully understood. The implications stretched beyond immediate tactical concerns into fundamental questions about identity, evolution, and the nature of consciousness itself. Chief Cryptech Zeras, his analytical mind working through the mathematical implications of quantum-influenced genetics, presented findings that would reshape Alliance policies for generations to come. The hybrid offspring appear to possess natural resistance to Tyranid synaptic interference while maintaining full access to warp energies. They may represent humanity's evolutionary response to galactic threats that conventional biology cannot address. The session that followed would be remembered as the moment when the Alliance chose its fundamental character for the ages to come. Rather than attempting to control or restrict the development of hybrid consciousness, the assembled leaders chose to embrace the uncertainty and provide support for whatever new forms of existence might emerge from the synthesis of mechanical precision and organic creativity. We will establish protocols for protecting and nurturing these hybrid children, Zarek announced, his decision carrying the weight of royal authority, tempered by democratic consultation. Not as weapons to be forged or resources to be exploited, but as individuals whose unique nature may hold keys to challenges we cannot yet imagine. The covenant between our species extends now to their offspring, whatever form they may take. The new protocols that emerged from this decision reflected principles that neither species had fully embraced before their alliance began. Hybrid children would be raised with full knowledge of their dual heritage while being free to choose their own paths of development. Educational programs would be established to help them understand both mechanical logic and organic intuition. Most importantly, they would be protected from those who might seek to exploit their unique capabilities for military or political advantage. As the first generation of hybrid consciousness reached maturity, their very existence would serve as proof that the alliance between Necron and human represented more than mere tactical cooperation. It had become the foundation for evolutionary possibilities that transcended the limitations of either parent species, opening pathways to forms of existence that the architects of biotransference had never imagined possible. The dream eternal 50 years had passed since the great experiment began, measured not in the precise chronometer cycles that had once marked Necron existence, but in the organic rhythms of seasons and generations that defined mortal life. In the memorial gardens of New Ketika, where flowering plants from a dozen human worlds grew in soil, enriched by the ashes of the first flesh lords to complete their natural lifespans, Zarek the Silent King stood in contemplation of what his people had gained and lost through their desperate quest for redemption. Lord Vexhai had been the first to die, his stolen body succumbing to cellular failure after 47 years of organic existence that had encompassed more growth and change than 60 million years of mechanical immortality. He had chosen to remain in flesh until the end, refusing the offered return to necrodermis form, even as his human organs began their final shutdown. His last words, whispered through vocal cords that trembled with approaching mortality, had been a simple statement that carried profound weight. I dreamed every night. It was worth the price. The memorial that marked his passing bore inscriptions in 3 languages: Necrontyre hieroglyphs that had not been written for eons, Imperial Gothic that represented his host body's heritage, and the hybrid script that had emerged among the children of merged consciousness as they developed their own methods of recording thoughts that transcended either parent culture's conceptual frameworks. High Executioner Vakran had made a different choice, his consciousness returning to mechanical form after 38 years of organic existence when advancing age began to impact his effectiveness as ambassador between the species. Yet the experience had changed him in ways that no necrodermis shell could contain. His mechanical voice now carried inflections learned from human vocal patterns, while his tactical analyses incorporated intuitive leaps that pure logic could never have achieved. I carry their memories within my quantum matrices, he had explained to Zarek during one of their regular consultations about alliance policies. Elena Vasquez's laughter, her tears, her wonder at discovering that consciousness could grow beyond its original parameters. These experiences cannot be deleted or corrupted. They have become part of what defines my identity. Commander Kethvar had chosen a third path, undergoing a second consciousness transfer that merged her hybrid awareness with that of her own hybrid offspring, creating a generational link that spanned both organic and mechanical existence. Her daughter, Elena Keth, possessed capabilities that defied classification, was able to manipulate quantum fields through organic intuition while processing tactical data with mechanical precision that exceeded either parent heritage. "We are becoming something new," Elena Keth had observed during a recent scientific symposium that brought together researchers from across the Alliance. Not human, not Necron, but a synthesis that transcends the limitations of either ancestral form. Perhaps this was always what consciousness was meant to become, not trapped within the boundaries of single-species awareness, but free to explore possibilities that isolation could never achieve. The hybrid children had indeed become something unprecedented in galactic history, their very existence challenging fundamental assumptions about identity, evolution, and the nature of consciousness itself. They aged more slowly than pure humans, while retaining the capacity for growth and change that mechanical forms could not provide. Most remarkably, they seemed immune to the various curses and corruptions that had plagued both parent species, their dual nature protecting them from biotransference-induced madness, while their quantum-enhanced neural pathways resisted the chaos influences that could overwhelm purely organic minds. Yet for all their remarkable capabilities, the hybrid generations faced challenges that neither parent species fully understood. They experienced existence in ways that pure humans or pure Necrons could barely comprehend, their thoughts moving through conceptual frameworks that required entirely new philosophical approaches to describe. Some struggled with identity crises that stemmed from possessing multiple consciousness streams, while others found their enhanced capabilities isolating them from both parent cultures. Imhotep the Stormlord, now serving as Supreme Military Commander of the Alliance forces, had observed these developments with the tactical analysis that characterized all his strategic assessments. The hybrid children represent our greatest success and our greatest uncertainty, he reported during a command review that brought together leaders from across the Allied territories. Their capabilities against external threats are unparalleled, yet we cannot predict what they will become as they reach full maturity. We have created something beyond our ability to control or fully comprehend. The Alliance itself had evolved far beyond the desperate cooperation forged in the face of Citan manipulation and Tyranid invasion. Trade networks now linked Necron tomb worlds with human colonies, exchanging technological innovations for cultural insights that enriched both civilizations. Joint research programs had produced breakthroughs in consciousness studies, quantum mechanics, and biological enhancement that neither species could have achieved independently. Yet shadows remained beneath the surface cooperation. Some human colonies still harbored resentment against the Necrons for the consciousness murders that had preceded voluntary transfer protocols. Certain Necron dynasties continued to view organic life as inherently inferior, tolerating the Alliance only because of its tactical advantages against galactic threats. The destroyer cults, though marginalized, had not disappeared entirely, their nihilistic philosophy finding occasional adherents among those who viewed the hybrid generations as abominations rather than achievements. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now in her 70s, and among the oldest surviving first-generation voluntary transfers, had become something of a living legend among both species. Her successful merger with Necron consciousness, while retaining her essential humanity, had provided the template for all subsequent voluntary procedures. Yet even she admitted to uncertainties about the ultimate implications of what they had achieved. "We opened doors that we cannot close," she observed during one of her regular medical examinations, her aged features bearing the weight of decades spent bridging incompatible forms of existence. "The question is not whether we made the right choice, but whether we can guide future generations in using what we have created responsibly. The potential for transcendence exists alongside the potential for catastrophe." Sharek himself had never undergone consciousness transfer, his sacrifice during the battle against the Deceiver having left him too diminished to survive the process safely. Yet he had found a different form of redemption through service to the Alliance and guidance of the hybrid generations. His ancient wisdom, refined through eons of leadership and tempered by hard-won understanding of the costs of ambition, provided stability during the turbulent early years of interspecies cooperation, or standing now in the memorial gardens where the ashes of the first Flesh Lords enriched soil that would nourish generations of hybrid children, Zarek contemplated the path that had led his people from the desperation of biotransference to the uncertainty of this new existence. They had sought to reclaim their lost souls, and discovered that souls could not be reclaimed, only grown anew through experiences that transcended original parameters. The price had been enormous. Millions of human lives, the destruction of the Deceiver's shard, the sacrifice of dreams that had sustained hope for 60 million years. Yet what they had gained defied easy calculation. His people had rediscovered growth, change, and the beautiful uncertainty that made existence meaningful rather than merely eternal. And they had formed bonds with another species that transcended utilitarian cooperation, creating relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting what they had built together. The hybrid children playing in the gardens around him represented possibilities that neither pure human nor pure Necron could have imagined. They laughed with voices that carried harmonics impossible to organic vocal cords, while manipulating quantum fields through gestures that followed mathematical principles no mechanical mind could have conceived. They were proof that consciousness could evolve beyond the boundaries that had once seemed absolute. That identity was not a fixed quantity, but a dynamic process of becoming. Yet questions remained that might never find answers. What would these hybrid beings become as they reached full maturity? Would they remain loyal to the alliance that had created them? Or would they develop their own agenda that transcended the concerns of their parent species? Could the cooperation between Necron and human survive the inevitable challenges of expanding beyond the current alliance into true galactic integration? The sun set over the memorial gardens, its light filtering through leaves that rustled in breezes that carried the sense of life in all its chaotic abundance. Somewhere in the facility below, the Soul Forge continued its quiet work, processing voluntary transfers for those who chose to embrace the uncertainty of mortality over the sterile safety of mechanical immortality. Each transfer represented a choice to value growth over survival, meaning over duration, hope over fear. As darkness fell and the first stars became visible through the atmosphere that had once seemed alien to his mechanical senses, Zarek made his own choice about the legacy he would leave to future generations. The Alliance protocols would be codified and preserved, ensuring that the cooperation between species would survive the passing of its founding generation. Educational programs would continue to nurture hybrid children while respecting their unique nature. Most importantly, the principle of voluntary choice would be maintained, allowing each individual to determine their own relationship with mortality and transcendence. The dream of universal redemption through consciousness transfer had ended with the recognition that true redemption could not be imposed, but only chosen freely by each individual consciousness. What had emerged in its place was something both more modest and more profound, the possibility of growth, change, and cooperation that transcended the limitations of any single species or form of existence. Whether future generations would call this achievement or tragedy, success or failure, remained to be determined by choices yet unmade and possibilities yet unexplored. In the end, perhaps that uncertainty was the greatest gift his people had reclaimed, not the guarantee of redemption, but the freedom to seek it through paths that remained uncharted and futures that remained unwritten.